I have gone meta into epistemology many, many times. Do you know how many times it has gone well? 0. Let me ask you something though. Doesn't it come down to epistemology? I mean, like, why can't we have discussions about epistemology? Why can't we say, okay, I can detect the mistake you made in that argument. It's an epistemological mistake. Here is the epistemological mistake that you made. Why does that get people angry? Why does that cause us to, quote, go meta and derail the conversation?
Maybe in a better world.
Maybe in a better world.
That would be what we would be talking about all the time. But people get really, I don't know, it just kind of.
Okay, so I'm completely agreeing with you that going meta never goes well. I've never had it go well, like ever. Okay, so I completely agree with you that it derails the conversation. It causes problems. Okay.
Yeah.
But doesn't it even seem reasonable? Like, most conversations are wrong at step 1. Like, their epistemology is wrong. And so they are already making a mistake at step 1. They've lost me at step 1, their epistemology. Okay. If you're actually going to have a true critical conversation, shouldn't a lot of our conversations be about epistemology?
Yeah.
Like, I can make a rational case for it. I just can't make a human case for it, if that makes any sense. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting contradiction. I think you're right. It should be. We should go meta all the time in our conversations. But yeah, it never goes well. I guess we're just too flawed.
The reason why I have gone meta so many times, and I know this is something people call me out on, is because I have experimented with, and I have extensively experimented with, is there some way to bring up epistemology that doesn't offend people?
Yeah.
And I have tried numerous approaches. And the problem is that I had to try it to find out, right? I had to literally, like, there might have been a way to do it. Like, maybe people just aren't going about it right?
Yeah.
So if you are super skilled, maybe you can, and I'm not a super skilled online discusser. Okay. Like, I suspect I'm just a hairbreadth shy of autistic. Mm-hmm. So I doubt that I'm ever going to be the most super skilled online discusser where I'm in text format and I can't pick up on any of the nuance that I need to be able to pick up on. Right. And I feel like text is like my worst. Okay. Yeah. It's like, I really just cannot do well with it. But I really felt like I needed to try all sorts of different attempts to see if any of them worked. And I don't think any of them worked. Like, I don't think any of them even came close to working.
Yeah.
So at this point, I'm actually in your camp. Like, it's basically pointless to try to discuss epistemology, even though that is what we should be discussing. Okay. If you actually want to make progress. Okay. So let me make a stronger case for that throughout this podcast. Okay. Today's episode is going to be about the problem of easy-to-vary-ness. Some of the difficulties of trying to sometimes make sense of what easy-to-vary-ness is. And I'm going to make a proposal on how to improve on the concept. I'm going to argue that there are no theories so easy to vary that with the proper critical attitude, you can't decide to make it testable and therefore actually test it. Easy-to-vary-ness at first seems obvious, but when you actually try to apply it to arguments, it turns out to be way harder to figure out if it applies or not. Okay.
I think that's a fair point. Yeah.
So what is, according to Deutsch, a good explanation?
Well, something that is hard to vary. Is that right?
Okay. So a good explanation is supposed to be hard to vary, and it's not clear that
there's a lot of ambiguity in these concepts.
There is. There's a lot of ambiguity. Yeah. Let's actually take the definition of easy-to-vary-ness from Deutsch, beginning of infinity, page 22. When theories are easily variable, I call such theories bad theories. I think the term easy-to-vary-ness brings to mind something somewhat different than what Deutsch actually says it means. So he uses the example of Persephone and Hades. Okay, this idea that there's a myth and that we're using this myth to explain why we have seasons. You know, that if you're familiar with the myth, Hades takes Persephone into hell and her mother's upset, so she makes the world be winter. And then when Persephone is allowed to leave, then she makes the world summer, and this explains the seasons. Okay, so on page 20 of Beginning of Infinity, he says, although the myth was created to explain the seasons, it is only superficially adapted to that purpose. On page 21, the reason those myths are so easily variable is that their details are barely connected to the details of the phenomena. For whenever it is easy to vary an explanation without changing its predictions, one could just as easily vary it to make different predictions if they were needed. Page 22. When theories are easily variable in this sense, experimental testing is almost useless for correcting their errors. I call such theories bad explanations. I want to emphasize that. He's claiming that if a theory is easily variable, experimental testing is almost useless for correcting errors. One of the things I'm going to call out is that I don't think this is actually true. It kind of is true. I mean, obviously, there's an intuition for it that there's no point in testing Persephone's and Hades as a myth because you can just keep adjusting it to get whatever explanation you want. Page 22 again. By adopting easily variable explanations, a person is ensuring that they will be able to continue fooling themselves no matter what happens. Page 25. It is only when a theory is a good explanation, hard to vary, that it even matters whether it is testable. Bad explanations are equally useless whether they are testable or not. So this is how he actually defines easy-to-vary-ness. I'm going to talk about a conversation I had with Jose Chalupa that really clarified things for me quite a bit. I asked him, I said, can you give me an example of an easy-to-vary theory and an example of a hard-to-vary theory? And he suggested an easy-to-vary theory would be spontaneous generation, and a hard-to-vary theory would be Darwinian biological evolution. Okay.
Spontaneous generation is just that life just forms without natural selection?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Now, if I had picked two examples, I would have picked creationism as the easy-to-vary example and quantum mechanics as the hard-to-vary example. Okay. Jose explained to me that why he thought spontaneous generation is an easy-to-vary example, which, keep in mind, I agree with Jose. So, I'm not trying to argue with him. Okay.
Sure.
But here's examples of what he says. He says that really this is an easy-to-vary theory because every experiment is easily defeated by claims like dust mites generate when the invisible mighty dust mite king wills it, or life only spontaneously generates when you aren't watching it. I want to emphasize that one. Life only spontaneously generates when you aren't watching it. Okay. And you can easily see how spontaneous generation, it's got no explanation at all behind it. Okay. It's at the level of grass cures cancer, right? There's no deep explanation. So it would be very easy to just add things like life only spontaneously generates when you aren't watching it, and thereby defeat every experimental outcome. Okay. So I can see where he's coming from. I can see why spontaneous generation is a good example of an easy-to-vary explanation. Okay. Go do a Google search of how science refuted spontaneous generation, and you'll immediately find the experiments done by Louis Pasteur and Francesco Redi. Okay. Science absolutely did refute spontaneous generation by experiment, via testing, exactly like Deutsch says you can't do to an easy-to-vary explanation. Okay. Here's a quote from the internet. Louis Pasteur, I don't know how to pronounce that name, provided evidence to disprove spontaneous generation through his famous experiment using swan neck flasks. He filled these flasks with a nutrient-rich broth and heated them to kill any existing microorganism. The swan neck design allowed air to enter the flask but prevented dust and other particles, which could carry microorganisms from entering. Over time, no new microorganisms grew in the broth, demonstrating that life did not spontaneously generate from non-living matter. When the necks of the flask were broken, exposing the broth to the dust and particles, microorganisms began to grow, proving they came from the environment and not through spontaneous generation. Okay. Now I'm going to quote Deutsch again. It is only when the theory is a good explanation, hard to vary, that it even matters whether it is testable. Bad explanations are equally useless whether they are testable or not. How can it be that an even canonical example of an easy-to-vary theory was in fact refuted by science via testing when Deutsch claims this is impossible? Or is spontaneous generation a hard-to-vary explanation? And Jose and me and you, Peter, are all just wrong when we were mistaken when we said it was an easy-to-vary explanation. Which do you think? I mean, obviously, I'm asking a question that I suspect is unanswerable. But if you want to give some thoughts on this, I'd actually be happy to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, I don't know. I think you're ruining another one of my go-to talking points with this hard to vary explanation thing. I don't know. I'm not sure I'm ready to give it up yet, but it's your pushback is interesting.
Okay. Now let's take Darwinian evolution as the hard to vary example. Okay. It turns out we can use the exact same arguments. And in fact, the exact same arguments get used when defending Darwinian evolution. Now, I mentioned back in episode 74, which was our problem of open-endedness episode, that I used to be a creationist back when I was a kid, not any time recent. And I happen to have numerous arguments with Darwinian evolutionists over creationism. So I actually have a intimate familiarity with how Darwinian evolutionists defend Darwinian evolution from a creationist. Okay. And I mentioned in episode 74 that I eventually did jump ship and become a Darwinian evolutionist precisely because creationism got refuted for me by observation. Now, again, we might ask, how's that possible? If creationism is easy to vary, how can any observation ever refute it? Okay, that's one I'm not going to answer for today. I'm going to save that for the next podcast. Despite this, I noticed that evolutionists that I argued with consistently easily varied Darwinian evolution to avoid refutation. Okay, so let's say that I ask you how to explain the existence of life given the second law of thermodynamics using Darwinian evolution. I'll even buy that once life exists, Darwinian evolution works, but you need to explain to me, using Darwinian evolution as a theory, how life got started in the first place. Okay. This is really... Right, this is a totally fair question, though.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, and so the argument against this was always the Miller-Urey experiment. Okay, and I would get an answer like this. Well, you say Darwinian evolution can't explain the creation of life, but there was this Miller-Urey experiment back in 1952 where they threw a bunch of chemicals believed to be present in the pre-Earth together, which, by the way, they got wrong, supposedly, and presto, out came a bunch of amino acids. So, like, half the problem is already resolved. My own high school biology teacher used this argument in class, okay? This is a beyond silly argument. Just because you can show catalysts exist that create amino acids, you cannot use them as an explanation for how life got started, much less declare it half the battle. This is literally like trying to explain airplanes and claiming, well, you see, there's these natural processes called supernovas that create iron, and then it goes into mines, and we mine the iron out. And see, I've already half explained where airplanes come from. So, you just, see, my explanation works, right? I mean, it's a terrible, terrible explanation, okay? If we needed to explain airplanes, we definitely also need to explain where iron comes from, and supernovas is part of that answer. But it isn't really addressing the question being raised by the creationists. In fact, it's not really even kind of addressing the question being raised by the creationist. Okay.
Uh-huh.
And so contextually, it's a bad argument. When I would point out to the Darwinians that this was kind of a silly argument, I would get a reaction like this. No, this totally shows your argument doesn't refute Darwinian evolution. It shows that there are natural processes that create life on its own. Now, in episode 74, I also gave the example of the flagellum in a bacteria and how there is not a currently known way to explain how it evolved under the current theory. Although we do have partial explanations. And this usually is very comforting because we can show that some of the steps follow regular neo-Darwinian evolution, okay, even if we don't know what all the steps are. And honestly, there's a certain unfairness in expecting a Darwinian to offer you a complete step-by-step guide as to how it happened, okay? Having said that, to some degree, it's still a completely fair question. Darwinian evolution requires that every single part of the flagellum of the bacteria has to have had a purpose other than what it's currently being used for, and it's this super complex set of mechanisms. And of course, we have no idea how that actually evolved today, okay? Why doesn't that count as a refuting observation, right? I mean, you can see why a creationist would raise it and say, look, I'm refuting your theory. I'm offering you a refutation. You say your theory is testable, And I'm offering you an actual example of where there is no current known way to explain it under the current theory. And you're basically just giving me a hand-wavy, easy-to-vary explanation on par with, it happened when you weren't looking. Okay? Almost identical to the whole dust mite thing, or the spontaneous generation thing. Okay? And isn't that really kind of what the Miller-Urey experiment's being used as? They're kind of saying, well, see, I can show you that catalysts exist and some of the stuff orders on its own. And then the rest kind of just happens when you're not looking. Okay? It's almost an identical easy-to-vary argument as someone who would be defending spontaneous generation would be using. Okay? Does this mean that Darwinian evolution is easy to vary? Well, of course, that would be silly to claim that Darwinian evolution is easy to vary. Yet clearly there is something basically indistinguishable from easy-to-vary-ness taking place when Darwinians defend their theory. There is no set of refuting observations to Darwinian evolution. None. There cannot be, because a Darwinian would always just say, well, we don't know how it happened, right? And that would actually be a fair answer. And yet it basically dismisses all refuting observations. It makes Darwinian evolution seem very easy to vary, which is, by the way, why Popper considered it not a scientific explanation. I don't agree with Popper on that, like even slightly. That was why Popper felt that way. Okay. Now let's take a look at my own example of quantum mechanics versus creationism. So now I already mentioned I'm not going to get into how I refuted creationism. Okay. But needless to say, I did. I was able to come up with refuting observations to creationism, and that caused me to jump ship and become an evolutionist. Okay. Does that mean creationism is hard to vary? What about quantum mechanics? Quantum mechanics is literally the best, most hard to vary theory in existence. And it is also probably the most easily varied theory in existence. So ask any average scientist how to explain quantum mechanics, and you'll get an apocryphal quote from Feynman that says, anyone who claims to understand quantum theory doesn't understand quantum theory. The actual quote, by the way, was, I think I can safely say that nobody understands quantum mechanics. And there are various competing interpretations of quantum mechanics that regularly get trotted out by the scientific community to, quote, explain what is going on and explain away the many worlds interpretation. So Boehm, for example, explains quantum mechanics as a particle that has a definitive position and momentum that you just can't measure. You just can't observe it, according to Boehm. Okay. It's happening when you're not looking, basically. Okay. Exact same issue with spontaneous generation. And this particle is attached to a giant quantum field, which is, of course, mathematically equivalent to many worlds, that moves the particle around via non-local influences. Okay. Copenhagen does no better, actually does worse. It explains quantum mechanics as a mysterious collapse that takes place for no discernible reason, as basically one of just the axioms of the theory. If you ask, when does it happen? You're told when you observe it. If you ask what counts as an observation, you get told, we don't know. I mean, we're literally talking about something that happens when you're not looking. It's the exact same problem as with spontaneous generation.
And now, are you saying that the hard to variness criteria has some validity in this the search for a good explanation about quantum theory? It kind of seems like it does. The
answer is that it does. But
yeah,
yes, we're getting to that.
Least hard to vary. Okay, that's where you're going. Okay.
Also, very often, you'll get told, if you ask these questions, that quantum mechanics is just an instrument, and they'll invoke instrumentalism, and sometimes called the shut up and calculate theory of quantum physics. So quantum mechanics, instrumentalism, is literally the single most easy to vary theory in existence. It would be impossible to have a more easy to vary theory because it's, by definition, you're not allowed to explain anything, right? And so whatever happens, is basically instrumentalism. So quantum mechanics, despite being something like the quintessential example of a hard to vary explanation, is consistently and routinely easily varied almost at a whim. Okay. So apparently, hard to vary explanations can become easy to vary, and easy to vary explanations can be tested and refuted as if they are hard to vary. So it seems we have a problem. No wonder no one can agree on what counts as easy to vary. It's really hard to even figure out how to apply easy to variness, to anything. Is this really just a subjective matter of opinion? Some wise advice from Vaden on this. He said, you can really just use easy to variness not to criticize other people's theories, but instead use it to just criticize your own theories. Just think about, is your explanation easy to vary? And you can use that to try to improve your explanation. That's very wise advice. Let me say, though, that really this moves the whole thing to the realm of subjectivity, that basically the ultimate deciding of whether a theory is easy to vary or hard to vary just boils down to your subjective opinion on the subject. That doesn't strike me as what I really want in my epistemology. Okay. Yeah. Even though it's definitely good advice, and I probably should have followed it a bazillion times, I want to try to reform the idea, though, to make it something more objective. And it turns out I don't need to, because Popper already did. So what is Popper's equivalent to the easy-to-vary criteria? I'm going to argue it's his idea of Adhocness. Okay. So let me now actually take you through what Popper says about ad hoc theories, okay, versus what he calls bold theories.
Yeah.
When we propose a theory, even just an auxiliary theory to save a theory, Popper says we must never make it ad hoc, and he objectively explains what counts as ad hoc. Therefore, ad hocness encompasses and subsumes easy-to-vary-ness, but in a way that is less subjective. And when I say subsumes, it actually exceeds it, okay? It captures not just easy-to-vary-ness, but also these other bad arguments we've been talking about that aren't clearly easy-to-vary-ness, okay? And it does so in a way that's very straightforward. At least in the case of empirical theories, there's still this problem of applying it to philosophical or metaphysical theories, because it's going to be entirely, at least Popper's version of it, is entirely rooted in testability, which, recall, Deutsch denies applies to easy-to-vary theories. I'm going to show why, in fact, you can test easy-to-vary theories using the concept of ad hocness.
Can we just define ad hoc would be something just created on the fly to save a theory?
That is the way you would commonly use the term, but Popper defined, that would still be subjective. Popper defines it in an objective way. So I'm going to actually use the quotes from Popper to show how he defines it.
Okay.
So the first thing we have to understand is the easy to vary versus hard to vary dichotomy is, first of all, not a dichotomy or anything even like a dichotomy. It actually captures three intermingled issues as if they are a single issue, which is why it's a confusing way to try to state things. The first thing it captures is how precisely the theory is stated via axiomatic statements that make it easy to see if you are surreptitiously changing the theory on the fly. That's the first thing that easy-to-vary-ness captures. The second thing is, how much reach does the explanation have? Now, in a scientific setting, reach, scientific meaning empirical sciences, reach is identical to saying empirical content, or that the theory has testable consequences separate from the problem you want to solve. It is less clear how you apply the concept of reach to a philosophical or metaphysical theory, so that's still a problem. But for scientific theories, reach can be understood as exactly equivalent to having empirically testable consequences other than the problem you've introduced the theory to solve. Okay. And then the third thing that easy-to-vary-ness captures is whether or not, and this is the important one, whether or not the person defending the theory is willing to ad hoc save the theory from a refuting counterexample by introducing untestable auxiliary hypotheses. Similar to number 2, your auxiliary hypotheses meant to save your theory must also be expected to have reach and have testable consequences, other than the consequence that you're trying to solve. In other words, easy to vary versus hard to vary is partially about the nature of the theory and partially about the critical attitude of the defender of the theory. The theory itself must be stated as precise axioms and must have testable reach, and the critical attitude of the defender requires that all auxiliary hypotheses meant to avoid refutation are themselves precisely axiomatic theories that have testable reach. Okay, the two are very deeply intertwined. Okay, the critical attitude of the defender and the theory itself. You cannot easily tease them apart under the guise of easy-to-vary-ness. I'm also going to argue that of these three, the critical attitude of the defender is the most important of the three. Now, let me admit up front that this is very much like trying to decide which blade of the scissors is more important. And that really, since number 3, the critical attitude, is defined by the first two, that you really can't say one of these points is more important than the other. But I'm going to make a case anyhow, at least a subjective case, that the critical attitude is the most important of the three criteria. When it comes down to it, It's only a proper critical attitude that can stop quantum mechanics from suddenly becoming an easy-to-vary explanation. So that means it's basically impossible to have a theory so precise and with so much reach that an improper critical attitude can't immediately make it easy to vary. I will also argue the inverse of this, that there is no theory so easy to vary that with the proper critical attitude, you can't decide to axiomatize it in such a way that it becomes testable and thus has reach. This is why spontaneous generation and creationism can be tested and refuted by someone with a proper critical attitude. Again, I'm talking about potential scientific theories here. We still have the problem of how to apply all this to philosophical or metaphysical theories. But let's look now at what Popper actually says, okay? A good theory is not ad hoc. The idea of adhocness and its opposite, which perhaps may be termed boldness, are very important. Ad hoc explanations are explanations which are not independently testable, independently, that is, of the effect to be explained. They can be had for the asking and are therefore of little theoretical interest. This is from Objective Knowledge, pages 15 to 16. This is why adhocness is, unlike easy-to-vary-ness, not subjective. Your theory either has other testable consequences or it doesn't. It's up to you to work out what they are, okay? The burden of showing that your theory is not ad hoc is on you, not on the people you're arguing with, okay? This, I think, actually answers the question. While easy-to-vary-ness is subjective, ad hocness just is not. It is easily detectable whether you're being ad hoc or not. And it's by simply asking, what is the other testable consequence? And if you don't have any, you're ad hoc. Now, I do want to emphasize that ad hoc explanations aren't necessarily wrong. There's a difference between being wrong and being ad hoc. But ad hocness is very important to understanding critical rationalism. So independently testable. Here's Popper again, this time in Conjecture and Refutation, page 327. We require that a new theory should be independently testable. That is to say, apart from explaining all the explicanda, which means that which we're trying to explain, which the new theory was designed to explain, it must have new and testable consequences, preferably consequences of a new kind. It must lead to the prediction of phenomena which have not so far been observed. This requirement seems to me indispensable, since without it, our new theories might be ad hoc, for it is always possible to produce a theory to fit any given set of explicanda. Okay. Now, I wonder if we've really given enough thought to this. Let me actually dwell on that just slightly. Well back in time, prior to Newton's theory, we had these theories of how the planets rotated, and are they ellipses or are they circles, things like that. Okay, we had these theories of planetary rotation, and we didn't explain it in terms of gravity. Okay, there hadn't yet been a unification of why things fall to the Earth and why planets follow ellipses when they're, circling the sun or whatever. Okay, and the way they would, quote, explain these planets is they used something called epicycles. Now, when they would find an exception case, when they would say, oh, we've now shown that this planet doesn't follow our epicycles, they would just insert more epicycles. And you could always do this. You could always come up with an explanation using the epicycle explanation. Any set of data could be fit to the epicycle explanation by just simply adding more epicycles. This is really what we're talking about here, okay? When this is the core of the concept of easy-to-vary-ness versus hard-to-vary-ness, is this idea that we don't want epicycle explanations because they can always be found. It is always possible, always possible to be immune to refutation, to a counterexample, if you're willing to use epicycle-style explanations, okay? And this is what I think we really are capturing with the concept of ad hocness versus boldness.
Sounds like it must have a place in the world too, these ad hoc saves as well, in that, I mean, what if epicycles were the explanation? I mean,
Yes.
it's certainly something worth exploring. I'm sure you can think of plenty of examples where someone comes up with an ad hoc save and it ends up being right.
I think that that's an incredibly important point. And I think you absolutely must understand ad hocness is not being the same as wrong, right? Because ad hocness, an ad hoc save could be right, okay? And it's very important to understand that. Now, ad hocness differs from easy-to-vary-ness in an important way. It includes our critical attitude as much as it applies to the theory itself. So here's a quote from Popper. It might be said that even if the asymmetry of refutation versus verification is admitted, it is still impossible that any theoretical system should ever be conclusively falsified. For it is always possible to find some way of evading falsification. For example, by introducing ad hoc an auxiliary hypothesis, or by changing ad hoc a definition. It is even possible without logical inconsistency to adopt the position of simply refusing to acknowledge any falsifying experience whatsoever. Now, that one of these I want to call out just a little bit, changing ad hoc a definition. This idea that you can immunize your theories by ad hoc changing definitions is a common problem with all online internet discussions and also with crit rats. In episode 70, you brought up the question of, is disobedience key to understanding general intelligence? And I argued, I doubt it. Okay, so is disobedience unique to universal explainers? Might be the question. So we might then offer a refuting observation. Well, dogs are disobedient, they're not universal explainers. Okay, that's a fair observation, but we can easily, through redefinition, avoid the refutation. Let's just redefine disobedience as doing something new, or basically set it equivalent to human level of creativity. Now disobedience is unique to universal explainers by tautology, problem solved. Don't try to look this definition up in a dictionary, you won't find it. And this causes some problems. Einstein is now discovering general relativity through disobedience. And when you rob a bank, you're actually not being disobedient, right? But if we're allowed to define any term any way we want while selectively ignoring the original concept the term pointed to, sure, you can make any problem magically vanish. You can always do this. It is an all-purpose way to immunize your theories. This is what Popper's saying. Okay, so this is an issue for a separate podcast. I won't go any further into it. But here's Popper's point, that you should not want to change your definitions ad hoc to immunize your theories. Why? Popper goes on to explain. I must admit the justice of this criticism. So bear in mind, the criticism he's admitting the justice to is that there is no such thing as a conclusive falsification. Okay, because there's always ad hoc auxiliary hypotheses or changing definitions ad hoc that you can do to avoid the criticism or avoid the refutation. Okay, but Popper goes on to say, but I need not therefore withdraw my proposal to adopt falsifiability as a criteria of demarcation, for I am going to propose that the empirical method shall be characterized as a method that excludes precisely those ways of evading falsification. Okay, so or put another way, critical rationalism, Popper's epistemology, is exactly equivalent to a choice to not introduce ad hoc auxiliary hypotheses or ad hoc changing definitions to immunize your theories. That is what a critical attitude is. Okay, and notice that Popper is defining critical rationalism less in terms. He's not saying there isn't such a thing as an ad hoc theory. He calls them ad hoc theories, right? But it is partially a nature of the theory. It doesn't have testable consequences, and partially a nature of your attitude that you have to decide not to introduce them, even though they could be true. This does lead to the problem, of course, what if they're true? That's what we're going to do in the next podcast, so I'm not going to go into that right now, because there is a way to deal with that. Okay, again, note, this applies to the empirical method. By the way, for those who claim that there is no scientific method, here Popper's saying, yes, there's an empirical method. Okay, but it does not apply, it only applies to empirical methods and theories, not metaphysical ones. So we still have the problem of how to apply this to philosophical theories. Now, here's Popper on reach. This concept of boldness as the opposite of Adhocness maps very well to the Deutschian concept of reach. In essence, your theory must have some consequences other than the problem you're trying to solve. This is what Popper is saying. So, quote, this is from Objective Knowledge, page 192, in order that the explicans, that is the explanation, should not be ad hoc, it must be rich in content, i.e. have reach. It must have a variety of testable consequences, and among them, especially testable consequences that are different from the explicandum, i.e. the thing we're trying to explain with the theory. Popper explains that independent is the opposite of ad hoc and in the extreme circular. This is page 192. But why is this important that our explanations have testable consequences different than the problem we're trying to solve? This is why corroboration is an integral part of Popper's epistemology. Popper now explains. This is Conjecture Refutation, page 244. For it is admitted that a theory may be ad hoc if it is not independently testable by experiments of a new kind, but merely explains all the explicanda, including the experiments which refuted its predecessors. Then it is clear that the mere fact that the theory is also independently testable cannot, as such, ensure that it is not ad hoc. Okay, that was a hard paragraph. Let me try to explain it. Popper is saying that even if we continually refuted one theory after another in favor of a better theory via crucial tests, our theories might still be ad hoc if they don't have entirely additional testable consequences that we can independently corroborate. An example. Remember that general relativity, before it was ever tested in the Eddington expedition, explained the perihelion of Mercury and the Morley and Michelson light speed observations. At this point, you might be tempted to say, this is now our best explanation, okay? Because not only does it explain all previous observations that Newton's did, but it also explains two observations that Newton can't, okay? At this point, though, the theory has been made to fit those observations, those known observations, and therefore could be entirely ad hoc. The way we test that it's not ad hoc is the Eddington expedition, okay? That we set up this separate test that nobody's ever thought to do, that we only thought to do because of Einstein's general relativity. And we go out and we get this other observation that's completely independent of why the theory was being created. And once it passes that test, at this point, we have a principled reason to believe that the theory is not just ad hoc. Okay, this is why corroboration is so important to Popper's epistemology.
It still seems to me that a lot of Popper's, the quotes you're reading from him ring true more as an attitude rather than a methodology, but it sounds like you're reading him as more of a methodology. I mean, if it was an algorithm, I think it would be much more obvious. Oh, you have to do this, this, and this to your theory, and then it's true or more true or something. But really, it's more of you want to have the right attitude.
From my reading of Popper, he does say that there is no scientific method. And he also says that there is an empirical method, which is the same as saying there's a scientific method. He does this fairly consistently, right? He defines science as empirical theories, right? So those are the same thing. I think the way you resolve this is, and I need to go pull the actual quotes, is that what he's really saying is that the scientific method includes this idea of conjecture, which has no method. Conjecture is just, you just creatively come up with stuff. It's true once you have the conjecture, there is more or less a method to how to go about criticizing it, basically by avoiding Adhocness, right? That you make everything independently testable. So science does have a methodology, but it's more like science is conjecture and refutation, and it's refutation that has a methodology, not conjecture. There is no methodology of conjecture, if that makes any sense.
No, that's an interesting way to put it.
Okay, and I think that's what he's actually saying. Now, I need to go pull the actual quotes. Don't hold me to it. When I actually go pull the quotes, I may find that I changed my mind. Now, I want to point out, though, that Popper is exclusively talking about empirical reach here. Like, whenever he brings up what I'm calling reach, using the Deutsch term, it's always empirical testability that he's talking about. He never really differs from this. And that's why trying to applying this to philosophical theories does become a much more difficult thing to do. So for Popper, explanatory content was not a good thing unless it was empirically testable. This is why Popper has a low view of communism despite its high explanatory content, all of which was moral and none of which was empirically testable. So I'm going to introduce Bruce's rule of moral reach. And this is the rule. If your theory has only moral reach and no empirical reach, you have a meaning meme, not a good explanation. And essentially, from a Popperian standpoint, come back when your theory has empirical reach as well. And at that point, we'll take your moral reach seriously also. What does Popper say about good versus bad explanations? He does, in fact, talk about this and does it in terms of Adhocness instead of easy-to-vary-ness and hard-to-vary-ness. So Conjecture and Refutation, page 81. One can show that the methodology of science, notice there, methodology of science, and the history of science also become understandable in its details if we assume that the aim of science is to get explanatory theories that are as little ad hoc as possible. A good theory is not ad hoc, while a bad theory is. In fact, I'm going to go on a limb here. This is where Deutsch is taking the idea of a good explanation is hard to vary and a bad explanation is easy to vary. And notice that the Popperian version is not easy to vary and hard to vary, but ad hoc or not ad hoc. Okay. This is why I actually think ad hoc is the Karl Popper equivalent to easy-to-vary-ness, but that it's a stronger version of it. Okay. Recall that ad hoc means has no empirically testable consequences other than the one problem we introduced it to solve. So a good theory is one that has independently testable consequences, and a bad theory is one that doesn't. Okay. Notice that Popper puts this in terms of testability, whereas Deutsch is claiming that it comes before testability. Now, page 193 now, the question, what kind of explanation may be satisfactory, thus leads to the reply, this is Karl Popper, obviously, an explanation in terms of testable and falsifiable universal laws and initial conditions. Now, you may have noticed that this is equivalent to what Chiara Marletto and David Deutsch call the traditional conception of fundamental physics, and they claim it as an inadequate mode of explanation. Taking this from Chiara's book, I shall call the traditional conception of fundamental physics that all fundamental physics theories must be formulated in terms of predictions about what happens in the universe given the initial conditions and the laws of motion. That's on page 26 of her book. Notice that maps almost exactly to what Popper says is a satisfactory explanation. The definition of what kind of explanation is satisfactory. Okay. This is an issue I want to bring up, but I'm not going to resolve today. And I think that Chiara and David would here say, look, we're not saying that this is a bad mode of explanation. We're just saying it's an inadequate mode of explanation. That some things could be explained better via other modes of explanation. However, I do want to just kind of really emphasize here that when Popper asks the question, what kind of explanation may be satisfactory? In other words, what is a good explanation? He says the reply is an explanation in terms of testable and falsifiable universal laws and initial conditions. So he roots the idea of a good explanation in terms of testability. So to Popper, a good explanation was an empirically testable explanation that has reach, by which we mean, in this case, independently testable consequences, by which we meant empirical consequences other than the problem we're trying to solve. Again, this leaves the question hanging, what about metaphysical theories? When critiquing Deutsch's constructive theory of knowledge, I pointed out that the theory has points that aren't explained precisely. Example, how long does adapted information need to keep itself instantiated to be considered knowledge? Thousands of generations? Thousands of years? Does it need to be a replicator or just a variant that outcompeted its other variants, even if it's not a replicator? Does it need to be a recipe in the sense of constructing something? Or can it merely, say, cause something to transform like, say, walking? Okay, I raised all these issues across all those podcasts that we did. Okay, the constructive theory of knowledge was imprecise in many ways. And this allowed the defenders of the theory to always find a way to defend the two sources hypothesis, which recall is the hypothesis that all knowledge comes from only two sources, Darwinian evolution and human ideas. So they would defend the two sources hypothesis by simply applying those imprecise criteria differently depending on the circumstance. If I were to ask you, is Deutsch's constructive theory of knowledge easy to vary? It would seem silly to answer yes. What is really going on is that the defenders of the theory are using the degrees of freedom to ad hoc save the two sources hypothesis and to be sure it can't be refuted. But they didn't have to do this. They could have removed the degrees of freedom by making the theory more explicit and precise than taking the consequences of that clarification. For example, they could say, I say it has to be 1,000 generations to be counted as knowledge. Take a stance, right? Be precise and take a stance. And then to which we can now respond, okay, then airplane designs aren't knowledge because we haven't yet even gone through 1,000 generations of airplane. Okay, so at that point we now have, because we were precise, we removed the degrees of freedom and became precise in what we meant, it's now easier to come up with counterexamples. There was a choice being made to defend the theory by refusing to increase the precision of the criteria for what counts as knowledge when confronted with counterexample. With this in mind, you can now understand why I keep trying to treat Deutsch's criteria for knowledge as axioms rather than vague illustrations. So now here is from Logic of Scientific Discovery, page 50, Karl Popper again. For a severe test of a theoretical system, i.e. an explanation, presupposes that the theory is at the time sufficiently definitive and final in form to make it impossible for new assumptions to be smuggled in. In other words, the system must be formed sufficiently clearly and definitively to make every new assumption easily recognizable for what it is, a modification and therefore a revision of the system. He goes on to say, this, I believe, is the reason why the form of a rigorous system is aimed at in science. It is the form of a so-called axiomatized system. The attempt is made to collect all the assumptions that are needed, but no more, to form the apex of the system. They are usually called axioms. So I was treating Deutsch's criteria of knowledge as axioms, then working out the consequences of those axioms. And the defenders of the theory were taking issue with me doing that because they felt that they wanted to treat them more as kind of vague illustrations. Yeah, sure, it's adapted information that keeps itself instantiated or has causal power. And yes, the walking robot example fits those criteria, but that's not really what we mean by knowledge. I admit to the subjective quality of the argument that they're making. But the reason why I kept going back to, but let's treat them as axioms, what then, is because of what Popper's saying here. That's part of critical rationalism, that you have to make a choice to make your theory precise enough that it's obvious that if you have a refuting example, and it's also obvious whether you've now changed it. Okay, go back to that example of where I said we could imagine someone saying it needs to be 1,000 generations to count as knowledge. You can then immediately say, well, airplanes aren't knowledge. And that the person then can say, oh, you're right. I'm going to now change that. But now you know you're changing it. You're not accidentally changing it. You're not accidentally moving it around arbitrarily to try to get rid of all refutations. It's forcing you to think more deeply about the theory and to error correct the theory.
It's more refining.
Yes. You can solve the problems by refining the theory, or you can solve the problems by being more vague and make the problem disappear. So why do we axiomatize? So this is Karl Popper. In a theory thus axiomatized, it is possible to investigate the mutual dependence of various parts of the theory. For example, we may investigate whether a certain part of the theory, in our example, the two sources hypothesis, is derivable from some part of the axioms, which in this case I'm saying is the criteria for knowledge. So if we treat Deutsch's criteria for knowledge as axioms, then offer a counterexample, we can now determine a specific flaw in the constructor theory of knowledge, namely the two sources hypothesis. But if we just refuse to axiomatize them, as the defenders were doing via an intuitive kind of hand-waving, isn't it just obvious the two sources are special? Then it becomes impossible to tell what the problem is. This explains why I kept insisting we treat the criteria for knowledge as axioms, and kept insisting that we take seriously the fact that the two sources hypothesis can't be derived from the current axioms. And I refuse to accept the hand-waving ad hoc saves being offered to me, no matter how intuitively obvious they may feel. I should note that Popper admits that science is not fully axiomatized. So this is more like a goal than something that is just always true. And here Popper says this, although the theories of physics are in general not completely axiomatized, the connections between its various parts may yet be sufficiently clear to enable us to decide which of the subsystems are affected by some particular falsifying observation. This is a little more than I need in terms of the argument I'm making, but what Popper is trying to say here is that one of the reasons why, there's various reasons why we try to make our theories so precise that we treat them like they're axioms and they're logic, okay? Axioms of some logical system. One of the reasons why we do that is because that's a way we solve the Dewey-Quine problem, where if you understand the system at a detailed enough level as axioms, and you have a falsifying observation, you can then use this detailed system to figure out which part of the subsystems are affected. You might be able to determine, for example, well, actually the theory itself is unaffected. It's one of the auxiliary hypotheses, okay? So he's trying to explain, this is why we axiomatize our theories. This is why we turn them into logical statements and get really precise about them, is because it's directly related to what we can learn by a falsifying example. In fact, it's directly related to if you even can falsify the theory in the first place. Now, I've often pointed out how common it is for crit rats to claim their theories are philosophical or metaphysical, by which they mean not empirically testable, yet still want to claim their theory is a best theory. You follow from these axioms and you work stuff out, but you can't actually test it. This is not the same as critical rationalism. This is, in some sense, the opposite of critical rationalism, okay? Now, that doesn't mean these theories are worthless. And Popper always emphasizes this, that metaphysical theories are not worthless, right? They often have a lot of uses. But we do need to understand that you don't get to just make up a metaphysical theory and offer it as a competitor to an empirical theory and then claim, well, mine's more explanatory, by which we really just mean, it's got no testable consequences, but it seems like a good explanation to me. And this is not what Popper's epistemology is about. In fact, it's the opposite of what Popper's epistemology is about. I would argue that the constructive theory of knowledge's two sources hypothesis is also an example of a basically philosophical or metaphysical theory that's untestable the way that it's getting treated today. When I point this problem out, I routinely get told, oh, so you're saying that every single empirical theory is more important than every single metaphysical theory, including Popper's own epistemology. Is that it? Cue lobster meme here. And I've had this argument numerous times, and I'm always told this by the crit rats. The moment I point out, look, you're trying to advance a metaphysical theory as a competitor to an empirical theory. You're not supposed to do that in Popper's epistemology. And this is always the argument that they use. But here's what Popper actually says. A theory which is not refutable by any conceivable event is non-scientific. Irrefutability is not a virtue of a theory, as people often think, but a vice. Every genuine test of a theory is an attempt to falsify it or to refute it. Testability is falsifiability, but there are degrees of testability. Some theories are more testable, more exposed to refutation than others. They take, as it were, greater risks. That's why he calls it boldness instead of hard-to-variness. Some genuinely testable theories, when found to be false, are still upheld by their admirers, for example, by introducing ad hoc some auxiliary assumptions, or by reinterpreting the theory ad hoc in such a way that it escapes refutation. Such a procedure is always possible, but it rescues the theory from refutation only at the price of destroying or at least lowering its scientific status. This is what I'm really trying to say to the crit rats I'm arguing with. When I bring up an empirical theory and you bring up a metaphysical theory as a competitor, that's not a good thing, right? That absolutely must be seen as a vice under critical rationalism. This is all, by the way, Conjecture Refutation, page 48. So yeah, Popper is pretty harsh on the idea that you can just trot out a metaphysical theory as a competitor to an empirical theory. So how does Adhocness solve our problems here? So let's take a look at evolution, Darwinian evolution again. Yes, large parts of the theory are highly empirical due to how the explanation fits, details strongly connected to the details of the phenomena, to invert Deutsch's statement of easy-to-vary-ness. And that is why I feel that Popper is wrong that Darwinian evolution is not testable. I could give you many, many examples of where we have tested and corroborated evolutionary theory. I will admit that there is no way to refute Darwinian evolution. Now, this is an issue that we're going to have to not cover in this podcast because it's already getting too long. The fact is that Darwinian evolution really isn't refutable, but it can be corroborated.
At what point in his career does he say that about Darwinian evolution? I'm just curious. Was this the 30s or 40s or?
You know what? It was in his last book. Sadia quoted it to me where he had to actually ask her. So he went apparently to his grave.
So it was in the 80s or 90s then?
Yeah, he was still claiming Darwinian evolution. But I'm going to explain this in the next podcast, I swear. Why is it that Darwinian evolution can be corroborated but not refuted? I'm cheating when I say that. There's a certain sense in which it can be refuted. And that's what we're going to cover in the next podcast. Okay. But there is a certain sense in which it's just true. There are no refuting observations to Darwinian evolution in the sense that we would actually drop it as a theory. But you can corroborate it through experiment. And we have numerous times. Like you think about like when we discovered DNA, and then when we discovered how DNA has to play a role in Darwinian evolution, and then we discovered, think about like how once they discovered DNA, they can start to say, this is how these two animals or these two plants are related to each other on the evolutionary chain. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Why can you even do that? Like if creationism, just kind of a naive creationism was true, that evolution played no role, there would be no reason for these two different plants to have the same DNA. You absolutely are testing Darwinian evolution in a very deeply empirical way when you start looking at DNA, right?
Oh,
This is
yeah.
why I really have a problem with trying to call Darwinian evolution a metaphysical theory like Popper sometimes did. And yet I understand why he had this concern, because it was more than a little obvious that you couldn't just refute Darwinian evolution using observation. Okay, and that's going to be the topic for the next podcast, so I'm going to move on. So Darwinian evolution, taking a look at it as to how adhocness solves the problem. So large parts of Darwinian evolution are highly empirical due to how the explanation, quote, fits the details strongly connected to the details of the phenomena. That's an inversion of Deutsch's statement as to what easy-to-vary-ness is. So it shows that it's a hard-to-vary theory. But this is exactly identical to saying the theory has a lot of empirical content, or it has reach. And scientific theories need not have high empirical content, or it would be impossible to get scientific theories off the ground. We've talked about that extensively as part of this podcast, but I've brought up the whole idea of oranges stop scurvy. There is no mechanism or explanation being offered that is still enough to start to have an empirical content, right? We can test the idea oranges stop scurvy very easily through a scientific experiment. Now, I'm not an idiot. Of course, back when I was a creationist as a kid, I went for where I knew evolution couldn't explain things yet, and I offered counterexamples that I knew had no hard-to-vary explanation yet. Offering the Miller-Urey experiment as an explanation for how life got started is an explanation that explains basically nothing. What it does is it pumps your intuitions from, well, a tiny part of the process took place on its own, so probably the entire freaking process can happen on its own. It's induction, pure and simple. It is an ad hoc explanation because it has no empirical content of its own. Here's the distinction I want to make, okay? Darwinian evolution is not an ad hoc theory, per se. It's got its own testable consequences. It may not have high empirical content, as high as, considering what a best-in-class theory it is, Popper's right that it does not have a ton of empirical content compared to, say, a physics theory, okay? And I think this is why he has this intuition that there's something wrong with Darwinian evolution. Is because he's trying to think of it like a physics theory. But it does have some empirical content, and there is no minimum amount of empirical content you need to have to be able to start being a scientific theory, okay? When defenders of Darwinian evolution offered the Miller-Urey experiment as an explanation for how life got started, that itself is an ad hoc explanation or an ad hoc theory. It's not Darwinian evolution that is. And this is the problem, is that theories are theoretical systems. They're all interconnected. This is why an easy-to-vary theory can be treated like a hard-to-vary theory. You can simply start to axiomatize it. This is why a hard-to-vary theory like quantum physics or Darwinian evolution can be treated like an easy-to-vary theory. You simply introduce ad hoc auxiliary theories to try to deal with problems. Let me put this in a somewhat different way. It might be easier to speak of not easy-to-vary theories, but theories being easily varied. And this gets closer to what I think the truth is, which is that it's more about the attitude of the defender and less about the theory. Okay. All the examples that we've talked about, where we said these are bad arguments, it's not clear that their theories are easy to vary. It's very clear that they are easily varying their theories. And this is what adhocness, I think, really is, how it connects to easy-to-vary-ness. So there are no easy-to-vary theories. So likewise, spontaneous generation is clearly a case of a theory that has very low empirical content, but not none, okay? Crit rats are quick to dismiss competing theories on the ground that it doesn't explain, by which they really mean you can't offer me a comprehensive explanation of every mechanism involved in the process all the way down. But no theory can do this, not even Darwinian evolution or quantum mechanics. Scientific explanations exist at many levels of explanation, and there is no minimum limit on how explanatory they need to be. Okay. Which is why this is a bad argument. Okay. It literally can be used to dismiss any outcome of any experiment. It is an all-purpose argument. So this argument is itself easy to vary, or it's ad hoc, because you just trotted out when you don't like the theory and you ignore it when you do. This is a clear case of subjectively deciding where to draw the line of what counts as lacking explanatory content, depending on whether you like the theory or not. So this is the distinction. Some theories are easier to vary, but all theories can be easily varied. Some theories are harder to vary, but all theories have some spots that are not currently testable. Quantum mechanics in many worlds, for example, or that aren't axiomatized yet, and thus is open to interpretation, such as with the constructor theory of knowledge and the two sources hypothesis. And these spots, these degrees of freedom, can be easily varied. This is true of all theories. It is true that if a defender of a theory is being dogmatic, they will prefer a theory that can't be easily criticized or tested. Thus, some theories are much easier to vary than others. That is, they have more spots that can be easily varied. But ultimately, what matters is not if the theory itself is easy to vary, but if the defender is willing to easily vary it. No theory is entirely protected from a dogmatic attitude, where the defenders of the theory may choose to routinely immunize the theory from criticism or refutation. Not even best-in-class theories like Darwinian evolution and quantum mechanics are immune to easy-to-vary-ness, or rather Adhocness. Okay? So, in summary, this explains each of the examples that we have looked at. Okay, two sources hypothesis, the defenders of the hypothesis rely on vague intuitions about, isn't it just obvious that there's something special about the two sources, instead of treating the criteria of knowledge as axioms and taking the consequences. I think that is a bad choice. They should not be doing that. It would be okay if they were upfront about it. If they'd say, here's our axioms, I point to a problem, they go, okay, let me try to redo the axioms. In fact, they should be allowed to have any number of retries with their axioms forever to see if they can get it to a set of axioms that do define knowledge only as the two sources hypothesis. That isn't what they're doing, though. What they're doing is they're hand-waving. They're saying, isn't it just obvious? I can't believe you have a problem with this. That's where they've gotten off the tracks with critical rationalism. The defenders of the theory use an all-purpose argument. It doesn't explain things all the way down. And without that explanation, all statistical tests are to be considered meaningless, even though no theory can do this. And except when it comes to theories they favor, then they accept it as evidence. They freely endorse a theory that they claim has no empirical reach, can't be refuted, but instead point to its moral reach. These are all examples of Adhocness. All of these examples violate Popper's epistemology via ad hoc reasoning. But I know from experience that all of these defenders will simply say, and have actually said to me at times, yes, but this is a philosophical theory, so it isn't held to Popper's scientific epistemology. Which brings me to the question I've asked a couple times. What is the difference between a bad explanation and a philosophical theory? And of course, I can't answer that question today, because that's going to have to be its own separate podcast. And it's not exactly the easiest question to answer, let me admit. Okay? It is not that easy-to-vary-ness is an incorrect concept per se, but it is a misleading and maddeningly subjective concept compared to Popper's concept of ad hoc reasoning. No one ever feels like they're choosing to vary their theory to save it. They always believe they're being rational and that their proposed save just follows naturally from their theory. Even a gambler, prophet, or mystic, to use Deutsch's terms, feels this way. They don't see themselves as varying their theories for the purpose of saving them. They see it as raising real possibilities. And maybe they're right, because ad hoc saves can be correct. We won't know until they try to formulate their theories testably. But the moment you choose to hold yourself accountable to make sure all your immunizations for refutation have their own empirical content that can be independently tested, it becomes impossible to keep fooling yourself. This is why I believe easy-to-vary-ness is an entirely subjective concept, whereas ad hoc reasoning subsumes and exceeds the concept in an objective way. Okay, that's my argument, and that's my summary.
So you're preferring Popper here to Deutsch?
I am. I'm not really saying that Deutsch is wrong, though. Like, I think he took the concept of ad hocness and he called it easy-to-vary-ness. The two concepts are really the same. But that he didn't define it objectively like Popper did, as having independently testable. Now, why would he do that? Well, it's because he wanted to show that easy-to-vary-ness comes before testability. And I'm going to argue that he made a mistake when he claimed that. that he had misunderstood something important about Popper's epistemology. I'm going to reveal something in this episode that I think is one of the single most interesting aspects of Popper that I don't think I have ever heard anyone talk about. Like, it is just totally missing from discussions about critical rationalism. I'm going to show it comes straight from Popper. Like, it's not something I'm making up, right? But it's an aspect of Popper that I think is super important and, in fact, critical to understanding critical rationalism. And it just gets no publicity at all. So I'm really excited to reveal that and to say, here's this thing from Popper that you missed that's really exciting. So let me just do a quick review. I challenge the idea of easy-to-vary-ness on the grounds that it is subjective. I also challenge the idea that we can always equate a good explanation to be hard to vary and a bad explanation to be easy to vary. There are other reasons for an explanation to be bad or good besides Deutsch's, to quote Deutsch, barely connected to the details of the phenomena. However, I offered Karl Popper's alternative to easy-to-vary-ness, which is Adhocness.
Okay.
So I think the issue is that Deutsch defined easy-to-vary-ness as that the explanation is barely connected to the details of the phenomena. That's a quote from Beginning of Infinity. But when you really talk to people about easy-to-vary-ness, they don't treat it only as that. They treat it as something far wider, right? And I think what they really sort of intuitively have in mind is Adhocness.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
And so I think the two concepts were really meant to be the same concept. Now, the opposite of that, hard to variness, is what Popper calls boldness. It's the idea that your theory is taking risks. And again, Popper's version is more objective, okay? Where Deutsch's might be easier to get an intuition for. So I showed that the two concepts were strongly related, that Adhocness in some sense subsumes easy-to-vary-ness, but in a way where it's objective. It's objective to tell if our theory is ad hoc or not. This saves Deutsch's concept of easy-to-vary-ness by subsuming it. And this is an important thing that you'll often hear me say, where I'll say critical rationalism subsumes induction. When you talk to a lot of critical rationalists, they'll act as if induction is completely worthless as an idea because Popper disproved it or something along those lines, right? And I don't think that's the right way to look at these ideas. Induction played such a critical role in the Enlightenment, in how we thought about science, and it would be a mistake to downplay the important role that it actually played, right? And I think this idea that critical rationalism subsumes it, or at least attempts to subsume it, largely subsumes it. That there may be some question as if it fully subsumes it or not. That's a discussion for another time. I think that this idea helps us understand that a lot of these ideas are okay to have all at the same time, right? As long as you understand how they're actually connected. So there's nothing wrong with easy-to-vary-ness, but I do want to suggest that when you really get down to, is my theory easy to vary, the very first thing you should do is turn to the concept of adhocness and say, is it independently testable? Adhocness subsumes easy-to-vary-ness into something that is both more expansive and also more testable. Thus, it is a better theory. Okay, just like Popper's critical rationalism is a better theory than induction as a theory, even though induction's got some truth to it. I think when I say induction has some truth to it, I mean the truth to it was exactly insofar as it was an approximation of critical rationalism. So that's the concept of subsuming something. So Karl Popper explains what adhocness is. He says, a good theory is not ad hoc. The idea of adhocness and its opposite, which may be termed boldness, are very important. Ad hoc explanations are explanations which are not independently testable. Independently, that is, of the effect to be explained. They can be had for the asking and are therefore of little theoretical interest. This is from Objective Knowledge, pages 15 to 16. This is why adhocness is, unlike easy-to-vary-ness, not subjective. Your theory either has other independently testable consequences, that is to say, it has reach, to use the Deutschian term, or it doesn't. It is up to you to work out what they are. Okay, so I argued that easy-to-vary-ness captures three intermingled issues as if they are a single issue, which is probably why it's a little easier to intuit, okay? Because you don't have to break it out so much. So it captures how precisely the theory is stated via axiomatic statements that make it easy to see if you are surreptitiously changing the theory on the fly. It also includes how much reach the explanation has due to, number one, And I specified here by reach, I explicitly mean empirical reach, how testable the theory is due to having consequences that we can check in the real world that weren't part of the problem we were trying to solve, okay? And then the third thing it intermingles is whether or not the person defending the theory is willing to ad hoc save the theory from a refuting counterexample by introducing untestable auxiliary hypotheses. So similar to number 2, your auxiliary hypotheses are also expected to have reach, okay? Now you can see how these 3 things are clearly all intermingled. Number 2 is based on number 1, and number 3 is taking it to the next level. Not only does the main theory have to be independently testable, but you're not allowed to save it through an auxiliary hypothesis unless the auxiliary hypothesis is itself independently testable, okay? Or that is to say, not ad hoc. In other words, easy to vary versus hard to vary is partially about the nature of the theory and partially about the critical attitude of the defender of the theory. That is to say, their willingness to introduce untestable auxiliary hypotheses to save the theory from refutation. I then argued that while number 1 and number 2 explain what counts as Adhocness, number 3, the choice to hold yourself to not use ad hoc explanations, was the most important of the 3 criteria. And I equated this to having a proper critical attitude. Or as Popper put it, I propose that the empirical method shall be characterized as a method that excludes precisely those ways of evading falsification. That's from Logic of Scientific Discovery, pages 19 and 20. I argued that the critical attitude, that is to say, the choice not to use ad hoc explanations, was the most important factor because all theories have places where the theory is underdeveloped or a bit vague, or where we just can't test it yet. And then I said, I'm going to argue the inverse of this. There is no theory so easy to vary that with the proper critical attitude, you can't decide to axiomatize it in such a way that it becomes testable and has reach. This is what we're going to talk about today now. So let's go back to the example that comes from the beginning infinity that Deutsch uses to explain his concept of easy-to-vary-ness. So from page 21 of Beginning of Infinity, he says, for whenever it is easy to vary an explanation without changing its predictions, one could just as easily vary it to make different predictions if they were needed. On page 22, he says, when theories are easily variable in the sense I have described, experimental testing is almost useless for correcting their errors. I call such theories bad explanations. However, I showed there was something wrong with this. We took spontaneous generation as an example of an easy-to-vary theory, and we showed that science had in fact tested and falsified that theory, despite it being an easy-to-vary theory. In fact, we struggled to find any examples of easy-to-vary theories that couldn't be tested or falsified. But what about this myth of Hades and Persephone that Deutsch is using? Can we do that same trick, just like we did with spontaneous generation? Could we actually falsify the myth of Hades and Persephone? That would be the key thing I would want to be able to do. Now, this may sound silly, like, who cares? It's just obviously a myth. It's so completely as an explanation disconnected from trying to actually explain the seasons that it almost seems like it's worthless to try to falsify it, okay? So Deutsch goes on to explain why he thinks it's kind of worthless to try to falsify it. So on pages, somewhere between pages 19 and 22 here, he says, but even testable explanatory theories cannot be the crucial ingredient that makes the difference between no progress and progress, for they too have always been common. Consider, for example, the ancient Greek myth of explaining the annual onset of winter. Long ago, Hades, god of the underworld, kidnapped and raped Persephone, goddess of spring. When Persephone's mother, Demeter, goddess of the earth and agriculture, negotiated a contract with her daughter's release, which specified that Persephone would marry Hades and eat a magic seed that would compel her to visit him once a year thereafter. Whenever Persephone was away, fulfilling this obligation, Demeter became sad and would command the world to become cold and bleak, so that nothing could grow. That myth, though comprehensively false, does constitute an explanation of seasons. By the way, this is where I just want to point out, I've often had crit rats online say that explanation that they don't like doesn't explain. It doesn't take much to be an explanation. There's a difference between being an explanation and being a deep explanation. And notice that Deutsch is admitting this does count as constitute an explanation of the seasons. But then he goes on to say, It is a claim because it's a claim about the reality that brings about our experience of winter. It is also eminently testable. If the cause of winter is Demeter's periodic sadness, then winter must happen everywhere on Earth at the same time. Therefore, if the ancient Greeks had known that a warm growing season occurs in Australia at the very moment when, as they believe, Demeter is at her sadness, they could have inferred there was something wrong with their explanation of seasons. The reason those myths are so easily variable is that their details are barely connected to the details of the phenomena. That freedom to make drastic changes in their mythical explanations of seasons is the fundamental flaw in them. It is the reason that myth-making, in general, is not an effective way to understand the world. And that is so whether the myths are testable or not. For whenever it is easy to vary an explanation without changing its predictions, one could just as easily vary it and make different predictions if they were needed. For example, if the ancient Greeks had discovered that the seasons of the northern and southern hemispheres are out of phase, they would have had a choice of countless slight variants of the myth that would be consistent with that observation. One would be that when Demeter is sad, she banishes warmth from her vicinity, and it has to go elsewhere into the southern hemisphere. Similarly, slight variants of Persephone explanation could account just as well for seasons that were marked by green rainbows or seasons that happened once a week or sporadically or not at all. Again, from Beginning of Infinity between pages 19 and 22. So to Deutsch, myths and scientific explanations are fundamentally different sorts of things. While there is definitely truth to this, in our last episode we show that one can have a bad explanation for an entirely different reason, not related to this problem of having the explanation be only barely connected to the phenomena. One could be making a circular argument, for example. We talked about using an all-purpose argument, selectively declaring any theory that you don't like as invalid due to, quote, not explaining all the way down, when in fact no theory does that. Therefore, if you don't like the theory, you say, well, it doesn't explain, and therefore all evidence is just correlations. But then when we're talking about something that they do agree with, say, does smoking cause cancer? Oh, yes. That's not just a correlation, that's an explanation. And you can see how this would very quickly become an all-purpose argument that you can basically dismiss anything you don't like and accept anything you do like by using this argument. Okay. And again, it doesn't seem like it fits very well with this idea of easy-to-vary-ness, where the argument is barely connected to the phenomena. The argument here is strongly connected to the phenomena, and yet it's still completely ad hoc. Okay. Or just change your definitions on the fly, declaring disobedience to be key to understanding general intelligence by simply redefining disobedience to mean doing something new and thus equivalent to human-level creativity. Or by adding an untestable ad hoc auxiliary hypothesis to avoid refutation. These are all examples of ad hocness that don't fit comfortably into the concept of easy-to-vary-ness unless you stretch that term more and more to be equivalent to ad hocness. In fact, it's fairly rare that an explanation is a bad explanation explicitly because the details are barely connected to the details of the phenomena, like Deutsch claims. This is one of the main reasons that no one ever feels like their personal theories are easy to vary, since their theory is connected to the details of the phenomena. The problem isn't the logic. The problem is that every ounce of these explanations are ad hoc to begin with, and so there's no particular reason to prefer them yet. Interestingly, Popper held a very different view of the relationship between myth and science. Okay, so let's go over what Popper said, because I really feel like this is important to understand. Popper says, this is from Objective Knowledge, page 347, the oldest scientific theories are built on pre-scientific myths. Now, what is new in Greek mythology, this is same page, what is newly added to all this seems to me to consist not so much in the replacement of myths by something more, quote, scientific, scare quotes are his, not mine, as a new attitude towards myths. That these explanations' character then begins to change seems to me to be merely a consequence of this new attitude. The new attitude I have in mind is the critical attitude. Notice how Popper's agreeing with my idea that the critical attitude is the most important part, okay, not the nature of the explanation. In place of a dogmatic handling of the doctrine. That's Objective Knowledge, page 347. On the other hand, it seems to me that the task which science sets itself, that is the explanation of the world. And the main ideas which it uses are taken over by science for myth without any break from the pre-scientific myth-making, objective knowledge, page 348. Popper instead claims that the real difference between science and myth is not the nature of the theories, as Deutsch was claiming, so much as the critical attitude of the individuals. In place of myth-making, this is again Popper in Objective Knowledge, in place of myth-making, we find the tradition of criticizing theories, which at first themselves are hardly more than myths. It is only in the course of this critical discussion that observation or empirical observation is called as a witness. So this is Objective Knowledge, page 348. So to summarize what he just said, he's saying actually the first explanations that eventually became what we think of as scientific explanations today, they all started off exactly the same as myths. There was no difference between myths and scientific explanations. And it was actually the critical attitude of the people discussing them that eventually led to this idea, we need to make our theories have empirical consequences. It was their attitude that led to that. And that's what Popper is claiming.
It seems to me you're kind of that Popper and Deutsch both had a similar attitude, and they see myths, almost like some validity in myths as sort of a pre-scientific, something that led into science. Is that fair? That they had, in some ways, more similarities than differences in their ideas about myths. But that what you're saying is almost like a question of emphasis in how they explained that process. Is that fair?
So mostly yes. So I'm getting to what I think is the one big difference. But I think you're right that it's easy to see that Deutsch is clearly, in some sense, almost quoting Popper, right? I mean, like a lot of Deutsch's epistemological ideas come straight from Popper. You can now almost find the quotes that he's using that he's then changing the wording on. So I do think you're right that there's a great deal of similarity to their views here. Okay. But I do want to call out that there is a difference. And it's going to turn out that this difference, it may seem slight at the moment, but it's going to turn out to be a big difference. And the difference is that Deutsch tries to explain what's wrong with myths, that they are easy to vary because the explanation is barely connected to the phenomena. And Popper is not taking that attitude. In fact, he's saying there's not a fundamental difference between myth-making and scientific explanation. They're a spectrum. And that what really makes the difference is the critical attitude. Now, let me explain why that's true. Okay. So the key difference here is Deutsch and Popper. To Deutsch, only certain kinds of theories can be tested. To Popper, once you have the right critical attitude, you can turn myths into valid and testable scientific theories. That's what Popper just said. And that is what's going to turn out to be the one big difference between Deutsch and Popper on this. Okay. At the same time, this is Popper again, Conjecture and Refutation, page 38. At the same time, I realized that such myths may be developed and become testable, that historically speaking, all or very nearly all scientific theories originate from myths, and that a myth may contain important anticipations of scientific theories. Examples are, I can't pronounce Greek names, Epimedales's theory of evolution by trial and error, or Parmenides' myth of the unchanging block universe, in which nothing ever happens, and which, if we add another dimension, becomes Einstein's block universe. So this is why Popper doesn't really have a negative view of myths. He actually sees them as there's no real break between myths and scientific explanation. But here is the problem. What do we mean by critical attitude? So Popper's saying the difference was a critical attitude. And is a critical attitude any less subjective than the term easy to vary? Now, every single one of the crit rats that has made arguments that on this show we've taken a look at and would say, oh, that is a bad explanation. We deconstructed their arguments. We showed that there was problems with their arguments, that they were making bad explanations. But all of them thought they had a critical attitude, right? Like, have you ever met anyone who doesn't think they have a critical attitude? Like, I've never met someone who doesn't very honestly believe that they have a proper critical attitude and that they've arrived at their beliefs, whatever they are, by very carefully thinking it out, and everybody else has the improper critical attitude, or else they would see that they were right? I don't care how wild the theory is. I don't care if it's a conspiracy theory. Like, everybody believes they have a proper critical attitude.
I mean, I guess you could take someone who's extremely wrapped up in something like romantic philosophy, believes in just following your feelings, and I mean that's not
Okay,
so
maybe.
common.
Maybe.
But then again, there's sort of a contradiction because how they probably, if you pressed them about how they would have arrived at those ideas about life, they would probably try to defend it as through something like a kind of reason that they
Right.
thought
Right.
people always look for reasons no matter what you
Yes.
yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to solve that problem. I suggested the way to solve that problem, the fact that everybody thinks they have a critical attitude. So therefore, when we say you need to have the proper critical attitude, and that's what Popper's epistemology is really about, that's entirely subjective. So I'm instead going to define critical attitude as explicitly meaning I follow the No-Ad-Hoc rule. And this is going to be critical for me explaining my point, okay? Where No-Ad-Hoc means I will only offer you explanations that have enough reach that they have testable consequences unrelated to the problem we're trying to solve. Or in other words, that all explanations offered will be formulated in such a way that they take empirical risks, okay? This is what I'm going to define as critical attitude means, okay? So now let's do an experiment. Let's take the myth of Hades and Persephone, and let's add Deutsch's test of Australia. So again, we have this idea that Hades and Persephone, we got this myth, it explains the seasons. We discover Australia, that it's warm right when Demeter's supposed to be sad. We've now offered this as a test of the theory of Hades and Persephone, and we've now refuted the theory of Hades and Persephone, okay? Now, here's the thing. It is definitely true, as per Deutsch, that we could easily save this myth by making a quick change to the theory, just like Deutsch suggests. And the fact of the explanation, a relationship between gods, is so disconnected to the phenomenon in question, trying to explain the seasons, this is particularly easy for us to do. But here is my challenge for you. Avoid that counterexample of Australia from refuting the theory of Hades and Persephone by offering me a non-ad hoc explanation. That is to say, you must offer me a counter explanation to save the myth that has its own testable consequences. And the consequences can't be something we already know about. You have to offer an explanation in such a way that we can all agree there is some previously unforeseen outcome, similar to general relativity with the Eddington expedition, and then we get to go test it. So, Peter, I'm going to give you that challenge. Can you avoid using Australia as a refutation of the myth of Hades and Persephone? Can you avoid it while holding yourself to the requirement that the new explanation you offer must be non-ad hoc, that is to say, independently testable?
Bruce, when you said here's my challenge to you, I was hoping you were talking about the listener and not me. I can't think that quickly. Okay, I'm still on my second cup of coffee. Let's just move on.
So I don't think there's any way to do it, right?
Okay.
You might make a mistake here and think, well, I could make it testable. I could come up with some myth and I could say, and I'm going to test it and then offer some other phenomena that it explains also, or something like that. But recall that according to Popper, it has to be independently testable and it has to be something, and I just gave the quotes on this, that wasn't foreseen. Okay? That if you take the right attitude, that I'm only going to offer those types of explanations, that refutation of Hades and Persephone will stand as a refutation. And you won't be able to come up with an alternative explanation to explain away that refutation. And by merely holding us to the No-Ad-Hoc rule, even myths can be tested and refuted. This is why I can't agree with Deutsch that when theories are this is quoting Deutsch, when theories are easily variable, experimental testing is almost useless for correcting errors. Page 22 of Beginning of Infinity. Once you accept the No-Ad-Hoc rule, even so-called easy-to-vary explanations can be put to a test empirically. This is why I'm going to argue Popper believes the real difference between myths and science are not some objective difference between the kind of explanation being offered, but instead boil down to one's critical attitude, or rather adopting the No-Ad-Hoc rule. as well as making your theories axiomatic and logically precise enough that we can work out consequences in the same way we'd work out other logical consequences. And this is how I actually refuted creationism back when I was a creationist. I mentioned that I had refuted creationism, and I didn't explain how. Let me now explain. Despite not knowing about Popper at the time, I have always had a rather critical attitude. I didn't merely offer up problems to Darwinian evolutionists that they couldn't solve, although I did do that. And in fact, as I pointed out, some of these problems I offered up to them, they couldn't solve even to today. And the types of explanations they would offer me were very clearly ad hoc saves. And at the time, that seemed like it was a kind of a strike against Darwinian evolution in favor of creationism to me. But here's what happened. I also researched what problems Darwinian evolution did solve. And then I chose to take on the burden of seeing if I could come up with an alternative creationist explanation for those same phenomena. So, for example, this may seem like a silly example, but remember I'm a kid, all right? I need to explain where dinosaur bones came from. So maybe I'd read in a creationist book that they lived before Noah's flood. And then I'd ask, okay, if that's true, then how might we test that? I'd then look up how they dated dinosaur bones, and I'd compare their dates with when Noah's flood was supposed to happen. And I'd find that there was hundreds of millions of years gap that I couldn't explain between what the dating was saying and when the Bible said Noah's flood was. Undaunted, I then tried to explain why the dating was off. But I'd find that no matter what theory I came up with as to why the dating was wrong, I couldn't possibly close a 200 million year gap like that. Eventually, I realized that even though Darwinian evolution had serious explanation gaps, and that was what I was finding when I was debating Darwinians, that couldn't be explained, the creationists had at least that much right, that they did have explanation gaps. It was nothing compared to how serious were the gaps in creationism as an explanation, if one adopted a proper critical attitude towards it. And I would need something like Darwinian evolution to close that explanation gap that creationism had. In other words, I took upon myself the burden of coming up with a testable explanation. Now, I know many creationists that do not do that, and instead give a hand-wavy response like, oh, it's complicated, or only God knows, or something like that, right? What separated me from these other creationists was my critical attitude of accepting the No-Ad-Hoc Rule. Of course, I didn't know about Popper at the time, so I didn't call it that, but that was the attitude I had naturally. This is why you can't really say that creationism is or isn't easy to vary. To me, it wasn't easy to vary. To other creationists, it might be. Or rather, I chose not to easily vary it, and other creationists chose to easily vary it. But the same could be said of quantum mechanics. Most physicists today treat quantum mechanics the same way that most creationists treat creationism. They simply ignore the no-ad-hoc rule, and this is talking about many worlds, obviously, and utilize ad hoc explanations to explain away the many worlds consequences of quantum mechanics. So that's why I do think it's more a matter of critical attitude. But you have to understand critical attitude not meaning as subjectively, I think I've been critical, but do you accept the no-ad-hoc rule? And moreover, do you accept the burden of explanation? People often talk about burden of proof. Usually both sides try to assign the burden of proof to the other side. And I know many crit rats bristle at the term burden of proof because they see proof as anti-fallibilist. By the way, it's not. That's something we would have to do a separate podcast on. But I can at least understand why they would bristle at that term. But I think the proper way to look at this term is more as burden of explanation. Moreover, who has the burden of explanation is always objective. You must come up with only independently testable theories, and you can only save them from refutation via independently testable auxiliary hypotheses. This is what is missing in the discussions I've had with crit rats.
It seems to go along with the idea of epistemic humility, right?
Yeah.
You should always be, talking about an attitude, you should always be open to the assertion that even if the theory you strongly believe in has problems, right?
Right.
But I'm not sure too many people are, but, on all sides, to be fair.
On all sides. And I need to be careful here because I am in the crit rat community and this podcast is about that. Obviously, it makes sense for me to take examples from the crit-rat community and criticize them. But I do not, even for a moment, think crit-rats are somehow more dogmatic or less rational than really anybody else I've met, right? I mean, every community you're ever going to come across suffers from dogmatic issues.
Very fair point.
Right, and it just is the way it is, right? Like,
Yeah.
you just will not find counterexamples to this, right? The one big counterexample, and even it, you can argue, isn't a counterexample, is the scientific community. And even then, if you go look at individual scientists are often very, very dogmatic in ways completely at odds with rationality, reason, or critical rationalism. It's almost more like, as a community, they are more rational, but individually, they're not more rational. And I think that's part of the problem is we're trying to get at, what does it mean to be rational? Why does science work? Why is critical rationalism the correct epistemology? Where does it have problems that we need to correct to get to the correct epistemology? And these are all the questions that I'm interested in, I want to ask. And you do it by looking at the errors, right? You look at where things have gone wrong. And this is really what it means to have a critical attitude, is you just take these, you almost fall in love with the problems of your theory. You want to solve the problems of your theory. You don't want to explain them away. You don't want to shift the burden to somebody else. You want to grasp that problem and say, it's up to me to explain this. And that's interesting. Okay. Now, I'm going to offer you an explanation for why the no-ad-hoc rule works. But and keep in mind, when I say the no-ad-hoc rule, I'm including the idea that you're making your theories logically precise enough that we can all agree what predictions it should or shouldn't be making using logic. Okay. So let's make a few assumptions. First of all, I'm going to assume realism is true. There is a real world out there and it is distinct from us. Now, it's not an accident that Popper was a realist. It's actually key to understanding his epistemology. Okay. Secondly, I'm going to assume explicability. So this I'm taking from Deutsch. The real world follows natural, explicable laws that can be precisely put in terms of logic or mathematical statements. Okay, notice the connection there with the Church-Turing-Deutsch thesis. That's not an accident either. Deutsch could see that there was a connection between Popper's epistemology and this idea that Popper relied on, that you can put everything into logical statements that you could then use deductive logic on. Okay. And then I'm going to assume the idea of truth. Statements about the world can be true or false, or maybe partially true. That is verisimilitude. Okay. Now, if I accept each of these assumptions, I can now draw the following conclusion. A true theory about the world can always be made logically precise, or mathematically precise if you prefer, and in that form it will have reach, that is to say, independently testable consequences. So that follows directly from those three assumptions now. Now, corollary, a false theory about the world either can't be made logically, mathematically precise and still have reach, or if it is, it won't make true predictions about the world. The no-ad-hoc rule, including the idea that we can make our theories logically precise, plays off these conclusions. It says, in essence, we could summarize Popper's epistemological view as, okay, if your theory is true, then you should have no objection to making it logically precise and then working out consequences none of us can foresee without the theory. Okay, I'm going to say that again because I feel like this is super important to understanding what I'm trying to get at here. Popper's epistemology could be summarized as saying, in essence, okay, if your theory is true, then you should have no objection to making it logically precise and then working out consequences none of us can foresee without the theory. Now, why is the no-ad-hoc rule a good idea? Well, consider Campbell's and Popper's idea of evolutionary epistemology. Their epistemology was that all inductive achievement actually comes from variation and selection, or if you prefer, conjecture and refutation. Evolution is therefore, under this view, a search algorithm. If you're doing variation and selection, how could that ever not be a search algorithm? After all, you're trying things, that's a search, right?
But you're not trying everything, of course. But I guess maybe, could you say that about any search algorithm, I suppose?
Yes. So
Yeah.
search algorithms can consist of comprehensive searches that then come with guarantees, or they can be not comprehensive, and you're just trying to find a local minima. So evolutionary algorithms are always search algorithms. Period. End of story. Okay. Now, can the reverse also be true? So let's take any search algorithm. Let's say I'm just doing an A-star search to find the shortest path, or I'm trying to just search through every single thing in a stack, trying to find the one needle I want. Okay. All of those are examples of going through many variations and then having some sort of selection criteria by which you select the best one. So all search algorithms are variation and selection algorithms, and all variation and selection algorithms are search algorithms. The two concepts may well be one and the same. And this is, in essence, what Campbell and Popper were getting at with Campbell's theory of evolutionary epistemology. This is important. This idea that all search algorithms are, in fact, evolutionary algorithms really comes from Campbell, from his 1970s paper. We typically understand evolutionary algorithms, or evolution, in terms of three concepts: variation, selection, but also replicators. And Campbell was the first to notice that the replicators weren't required. That sometimes they're nice to have as part of the variation and selection algorithms. They have a purpose. In fact, in machine learning, we actually study what that purpose is. And what they do is the replicators then create a sort of proxy for the search space, the fitness landscape. Even without replicators, you can still do variation and selection, and it still works in exactly the same way that evolutionary epistemology works. Because of this, search algorithms and evolutionary algorithms have a deep link, or may even be identical if Campbell is correct. This really helped me make sense of why the No-Ad-Hoc Rule is so useful. The No-Ad-Hoc Rule drastically prunes the search tree. Okay? There's this gigantic tree of possible ideas, an infinitely large tree of possible human ideas. And when you say, I'm only going to hear out theories that are independently testable, I'm only going to hear out those theories. Even if they're true, I'm not going to hear out your theory if it isn't independently testable. Okay? You have drastically reduced the search tree. This is really why the No-Ad-Hoc Rule is such a great thing. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute. Couldn't that be bad, though? And this is something that comes up in machine learning and artificial intelligence. What if your search algorithm prunes out the correct answer? Okay. This is really a concern in artificial intelligence. If you make the search algorithm remove the correct answer, you may not know you've removed it, but if you've removed it, then you're going to end up with some sort of approximate answer that's nowhere near as good. Okay. One of the things I want to argue is that artificial intelligence is actually the study of epistemology. But anyhow, that's for another time. So you're only going to consider theories once they have been put in a certain form. That is to say that they are precise enough that we can all agree they have testable consequences beyond the problem you were trying to solve. Because, as per our assumptions, all true theories can, at least in principle, be put in such a form, this form that they're independently testable, we are not, according to these assumptions, eliminating any true theory from the search. This is why the No-Ad-Hoc Rule is so great. It at once drastically reduces the size of the search tree and prunes it, but also never removes a true answer from the search tree. I feel like this is one of the most important aspects of Popper's epistemology. Popper's No-Ad-Hoc Rule, it's a heuristic, but it's an admissible heuristic. It does not remove the correct answer. So it does this huge pruning of the search tree, but it always leaves true answers in the search tree. Now, of course, we're doing this based on assumptions, realism, that there is such an idea of truth, explicability, the idea that all explanations can be put into logical terms, computable terms. Logical terms for Popper, but if they're logical, then we can put them into logic circuits, therefore they're computable. Okay. So if you hold on to those three assumptions, then it's guaranteed that the No-Ad-Hoc Rule will at once drastically reduce the search tree and also leave the true answers there. If it turns out one of those assumptions isn't true, then that would no longer be true. These two are connected, right? You can't just split these things apart. Popper's epistemology, Church-Turing-Deutsch thesis, and this idea of realism, this idea of universal explainers and explicability, none of these ideas can be teased apart. They're all part of one overall theory. So because, as per our assumptions, all true theories can, at least in principle, be put in such a form that they're independently testable, precise enough to be independently testable, we are not, according to the assumptions, actually eliminating a path to any true theory. And we're avoiding wasting time by refusing to deal with any theory that is not yet put into such a form meaning that it's precise enough that it has independently testable consequences. Now, interestingly, I don't think Deutsch disagrees with anything I just said. Even though I've been criticizing some of the things he said, I actually think that at some level, Deutsch completely agrees with what I'm saying. So Deutsch, in Logic of Experimental Tests, almost says the same thing about how we usually have very few good explanations available. So here's the quote from Logic of Experimental Tests, page 11. And although there are always countless logically consistent options for which theory to reject, the number of good explanations known for an explicandum is always small. Things are going very well when there are as many as two, with perhaps the opportunity for a crucial test. More typically, there is 1 or 0. This is Deutsch saying the same thing. When you require all explanations to follow the No-Ad-Hoc Rule, to be put into a form that are precise enough that it has independently testable consequences, it is so hard to come up with them that you're doing really great if you've got 2. In fact, that is the ultimate gold standard, and it's super hard to get to. You're doing great if you even have 1. And this is why this concept of a best explanation really comes down to, I currently have only 1 independently testable explanation for this phenomenon. There may be an infinity of non-testable explanations out there, and they may be the true explanation. But at the moment, I'm going with the one that's independently testable. And the reason why is because if one of those others out in that morass of non-testable theories, if the true explanation is in that morass, it will be possible to eventually figure out how to turn it into an independently testable explanation, and it will eventually become part of the search algorithm. But at the moment, nobody knows how to do that, so I'm not going to consider it any further, because if I do, the problem becomes completely intractable. And this is why science works. And this is Popper's explanation for why science works. And it makes progress so fast compared to the pre-scientific era. So whereas Deutsch defines good theory as hard to vary, which I said was subjective, Popper defines good theory as not ad hoc. Okay, so here's a quote from Popper, Conjecture and Refutation, page 81. One can show that the methodology of science and the history of science also become understandable in its details if we assume that the aim of science is to get explanatory theories that are as little ad hoc as possible. A good theory or good explanation is not ad hoc, while a bad theory is. Conjecture and Refutation, page 81. Recall, ad hoc means has no empirically testable consequences other than the one problem it was introduced to solve. So while to Deutsch, we are maximizing explanation without usually offering a precise understanding of what we mean by maximizing explanation, Popper offers a very precise criteria for a good explanation. It has independently testable consequences. The No-Ad-Hoc Rule has some fascinating consequences that I've never seen anyone talk about. And this is the thing I've been wanting to talk about, because just nobody talks about this. But this seemed to follow directly from Popper's epistemology, the most important of which could be stated like this. You must solve all problems solely by increasing the empirical content of our theories. You are never allowed to solve problems by reducing empirical content of our theories. This follows naturally from the very fact that every problem requires an explanation that, if you're following the No-Ad-Hoc Rule itself, has its own independently testable consequences. This means that our combined theoretical system will only ever grow in terms of testable consequences, or in other words, it will only grow in terms of empirical content. Popper discusses this idea in Logic of Scientific Discovery. So I didn't make this idea up. I'm getting this straight from having read Popper, okay? he says, as regards auxiliary hypotheses, we propose the rule that only those auxiliary hypotheses are acceptable whose introduction does not diminish the degree of falsifiability or testability of the system in question, but on the contrary, increases it. If the degree of falsifiability is increased, then introducing the hypothesis has actually strengthened the theory. I'm hoping that term, strengthen the theory, just got every crit rat's hackles up, but this is Popper who's talking, okay? The system now rules out more than it did previously. It prohibits more. We can also put it like this. The introduction of an auxiliary hypothesis should always be regarded as an attempt to construct a new system, and this new system should then always be judged on the issue of whether it would, if adopted, constitute a real advance in our knowledge of the world. For those who claim you cannot strengthen the theory, yes, you can. You can make your theories more empirical. Okay, that's what it means to strengthen the theory. So to quote Popper, as he put it, a theory which is not refutable by any conceivable event is non-scientific. Irrefutability is not a virtue of a theory, as people often think, but a vice. Conjecture Refutation, page 36. It is only in context of this idea that we are only allowed to solve problems by increasing the empirical content that we can understand how Popper understood falsifiability or refutability. To many crit rats that I've talked to refute a theory is merely to make a criticism that you personally find convincing. But this isn't what Popper meant by refutability. He specifically understood refutability and falsifiability as being equivalent to the theory having empirical content. Here is what Popper actually says. The criteria of the scientific status of a theory is its falsifiability or refutability or testability. He sees these as synonyms. That's Conjecture Refutation, page 48. Or, he says on page 36, every genuine test of a theory is an attempt to falsify it or refute it. Testability is falsifiability. But there are degrees of testability. Some theories are more testable, more exposed to refutation than others. They take, as it were, greater risks. So to Popper, we compare theories and we prefer the better explanation, by which he specifically means the more testable theory with the higher amount of empirical content. And on Logic of Scientific Discovery, page 105, he says, thus I regard the comparison of empirical content of two statements as equivalent to the comparison of their degrees of falsifiability. This makes our methodological rule that those theories should be given preference which can be most severely tested. That's equivalent to the rule favoring theories with the highest possible empirical content. Okay. There's just no doubt this is what Popper meant, right? He's so clear on this. So I'm a little unsure, and this is something that we should cover in a separate podcast, how this idea that refutation just meant I made a criticism that I personally find convincing, when Popper was so specifically talking about your theory must have independently testable consequences, and it must have actually survived those tests, and it must have empirical content, and and the more empirical content it has, the better. And we will always prefer the theory with the highest empirical content. I mean, like, there's just no doubt that is what, and I just quoted him, that is clearly what he meant. So Popper is pretty harsh on the idea that you can just trot out a metaphysical theory as a competitor to an empirical theory, like crit rats often do. So this idea that we're only allowed to increase the amount of empirical content, let's give this idea a name. This is the idea that I just quoted from Popper. He clearly says it. I just make sure that there's no doubt I got this idea from Popper reading Logic of Scientific Discovery. But this idea is the one I've never heard people talk about. Okay, let's give it a name so we can talk about it really easily. The name I'm going to coin for it, this is my term, is Popper's Ratchet. Popper's Ratchet is this idea that you are only allowed to solve problems by making your theories more precise and increasing the empirical content of your theories, never by making them vaguer or adding degrees of freedom or reducing the empirical content of your theories. This is what I'm going to call Popper's Ratchet. That's my term. That's why you've never heard it before. But the idea is 100% Popper. I made the term up, not the idea. Understanding Popper's Ratchet is key to understanding why discovery of the scientific method exploded into this incredibly fast progress. And it's also key to understanding the difference between dogmatism and a critical attitude. Indeed, it literally defines what it means to have a critical attitude versus being dogmatic. How do we increase the empirical content of a theory? Well, Popper, and I had the quotes from the previous podcast where I quoted Popper. So let me just kind of summarize what Popper said. The key thing is to make your theories more universal so that they are easier to falsify, make them so that they are more prohibitive, if you will. Or rather, easier to imagine falsifying cases while it's actually impossible to find them in real life. Now, this is something that I don't think Popper ever quite explained well. He often talked about falsifiability, but a true theory can't be falsified. So in a certain sense, a true theory could never have any falsifiability. What Popper really has in mind is the ease with which you could imagine a counterexample. So think about like Newton's theories, okay? But for the sake of argument, let's say that Newton's theory had never been falsified. For hundreds of years, Newton's theories had zero counterexamples, okay? And so people just thought it was just the truth. But it was super easy to imagine what a counterexample would look like. You could just imagine dropping that rock and the rock falls and it hits the ground and it doesn't follow the equations that Newton gave you, okay? Falsifiability is the ease with which we can easily work out what a counterexample would look like. It's not actually the ability to find a counterexample. So the key thing here is if you make your theories more universal, then it makes them easier to falsify. He says the degree of corroboration of a theory, which has a higher degree of universality, this is Popper, can thus be greater than that of a theory which has a lower degree of universality and therefore a lower degree of falsifiability. Related to that is making our theories more precise. And Popper, this is from Logic of Scientific Discovery, page 268. In a similar way, theories of a higher degree of precision can be better corroborated than less precise ones. The second way we could do this is we could remove degrees of freedom. You can make a theory more precise by making it axiomatic and thus easy to tell if it's changed or not. This is what Popper had said, plus easier to apply logic to. So Logic of Scientific Discovery, page 50, Popper says, for a severe test of a theoretical system, or in other words, an explanation, presupposes that it, the theory, is at the time sufficiently definitive and final in form to make it impossible for new assumptions to be smuggled in. In other words, the system must be formed sufficiently clearly and definitively to make every new assumption easily recognizable for what it is, a modification and therefore a revision of the system. Okay, this is why precision is so important to understanding Popper's epistemology. It's actually a way of increasing the empirical content of your theory. You make it more precise, make it more universal, but also if you make it more precise, the number of things that you can say, oh, that theory now implies this, and you can go test the theory, goes up. Your empirical content grows, okay? Or put another way, Popper's ratchet implies that we're always reducing the degrees of freedom of a theory rather than making our theories vaguer. Note that if your theory can't be put into precise logical terms, Popper's epistemology could not apply to it. This is how Church-Turing-Deutsch thesis and Popper's epistemology interact, and in fact are one and the same thing. So why is Popper's ratchet not talked about? I'm going to suggest that there are at least some psychological reasons for why that is. Popper's ratchet is the secret to why science makes fast progress, but it is not what human beings enjoy doing in their arguments. Human beings want to reason using their intuitions. Peter, you and I, we talk about things and we'll often say, that rings true to me, right? That's using your intuition. Something feels true. It kind of rings true, even if you can't tell exactly why, okay? Popper's ratchet takes a lot of the fun out of it. Our intuitions feel correct to us. It's very hard to believe that they aren't just truth. So here is an example that I thought was brilliant. This comes from Hans Rosling from his book Factfulness.
Oh, yes. I read it. Kind of an essential in the optimism canon,
yes.
Say. Yeah.
So Rosling gives an example that in the moment I heard it, I thought, oh, I got to use this in a podcast. He says, one evening in 1974, I was shopping for bread at a supermarket in a small Swedish town when I suddenly discovered a baby in a life-threatening situation. An untrained eye couldn't see the danger, but fresh out of medical school, I heard my alarm bells go off. I walked over to the stroller as quickly as I could, and I lifted the baby, who was asleep on his back, and I turned him over and put him on his tummy. Now, are you familiar with this at all? Do you know?
Oh yeah, yeah. We went through that with our babies. I feel like maybe people have come away from that a little.
No,
bit.
it's the opposite today. So, and this is the point he's making. You want
Oh.
your baby sleeping on its back, not its tummy, because there's good evidence that if your
Yeah.
baby's sleeping on its tummy, that the incidence of SIDS goes
Sits,
up.
yeah,
right?
that's right. That's
Okay,
right.
so he's actually doing the exact opposite, because back in 1974, they thought it was exactly the opposite. Okay. So he goes on to explain that back then, we thought it was dangerous to let babies sleep on their backs because it was well known that during the wars, like World War II and such, soldiers on their backs tended to die if they were unconscious. They would, while unconscious, vomit and drown in their own vomit. So we learned to put them on their stomachs so that the vomit would come out of their mouth and they wouldn't die. So the assumption was that this should apply to babies, given that babies also vomit while they're unconscious.
I used to worry about our babies doing that, but you have to be like, I mean, when all these rock stars die of choking on their own vomit, they're heavily medicated.
Yes,
Obviously.
you've done it.
So when a baby would never, unless you're giving your baby drugs and alcohol, it's always going to wake up when it vomits.
That's right. He actually goes on to explain that. He points out that it seemed like it was just pure logic. If soldiers die due to vomit when they're on their backs, babies should too. It didn't feel like a conjecture. It felt like they were just working out an obvious logical outcome of an explanation. But actually, it's far more dangerous for babies to sleep on their tummies because that leads to SIDS. So he goes on to say, the mental clumsiness of a generalization like this is often difficult to spot. The chain of logic seems correct. When seemingly impregnable logic is combined with good intentions, it becomes nearly impossible to spot the generalization error. Even though the data showed that sudden infant deaths went up, not down, when you put them on their tummies, it wasn't until 1985 that a group of pediatricians in Hong Kong actually suggested that the prone position might be the cause. Even then, doctors in Europe didn't pay attention. It took Swedish authorities another 7 years to accept their mistake and reverse the policy. Unconscious soldiers were dying on their backs when they vomited. Sleeping babies, unlike unconscious soldiers, have fully functioning reflexes and turn to their sides if they vomit while on their backs. But on their tummies, maybe some babies are not yet strong enough to tilt their heads up to keep their airways open. He then goes on to say that last part's a conjecture. They're not actually sure if that's the reason or not yet. Okay, but it may be the reason why sudden infant death syndrome goes up when you put babies in their tummies, is that some babies may be vomiting when they're on their tummies. They can't move their heads enough, and so the airway stays closed. This is, in a nutshell, the real problem of induction or generalizing. All our generalizations are actually just conjectures. This is actually what Popper is saying, right? They're conjectures. No matter how much they feel like pure logic, they need to be actually tested to see if we made a mistake somewhere in that chain of pure logic. Popper's Ratchet also reveals how often our favorite ideas are really just meaning memes and not the best theories that we thought they were. It forces one to admit that most of the time, we just don't know what the best theory is because none of the competing theories are actually currently testable, or all of them are equally testable, so there's no clear winner, that some work in some cases and some work in other cases. It forces one to take a far more fallibilist stance, except in the rare cases where best theories, that is to say, there's only one good explanation, that is to say, there's only one explanation that is independently testable empirically, emerges. People seem to have an almost primal urge to believe they've thought things through and that they've worked out the truth. So we're almost constantly in danger of becoming dogmatic. So as an appendice, one might ask, okay, Bruce, even if I buy Popper's Ratchet, how would we ever get conjectures in the first place? I don't know if someone would ask this or not. I asked this, okay. When Einstein comes up with his conjecture that Newton's theory is wrong and that instead we need to be thinking of some sort of new theory that treats gravity not as a force, at that point, his explanation is entirely non-testable. And it's going to take him 8 years. It literally is going to take him 8 years to turn it into a testable theory. So for 8 years, is Einstein being irrational, preferring his theory over Newton's theory? Okay, so that's the Steelman version of the issue I'm trying to raise. Okay, here's my answer to that question. I'm going to answer it with a question. And the question is, did Popper say there was or wasn't a scientific method? This is why I recently had a tweet where I asked for where did Popper say that there wasn't a scientific method? And David Deutsch himself responded to the tweet and gave me the reference so that I could use it for this podcast, by the way. So thank you, David Deutsch, for helping me out here. You hear all the time that Popper said there was no scientific method. And here's the actual quote that gets quoted where he says this. He's like teaching a course in the scientific method. He says, the course is in scientific method. It is called Introduction to Scientific Method. And the first thing I want to say as an introduction is that this is a subject that does not exist. Now, you may have noticed, as I emphasized it a little, that in the quotes I just made from Popper, explaining what Popper's ratchet was, that he without a doubt said there was a scientific method. So we've kind of got these two things. One where you've got definitive quotes from Popper where he says there isn't a scientific method, and ones from Popper where he definitively says there is a scientific method. Okay? Now, how do we reconcile this? And it turns out that the way we reconcile this is the answer to the question I just asked. Specifically, Popper said that part of the scientific method was this idea that we have rules or conventions, such as the No-Ad-Hoc Rule, which is the basis for Popper's ratchet, that we follow because they make it so that theories can be falsified, and that if you don't follow them, then no theory can be falsified. Okay, and that is what Popper said the scientific method was. It was this group of rules or conventions that you followed. So in Logic of Scientific Discovery, here's the actual quote. I tried to define empirical science with the help of the criterion of falsifiability, but I was obliged to admit the justice of certain objections. I promised a methodological supplement to my definition. Just as chess might be defined by the rules proper to it, so empirical science may be defined by means of its methodological rules. That's page 32 of Logic of Scientific Discovery. First, a supreme rule is laid down, this is Popper again, which serves as a kind of norm for deciding upon the remaining rules, and which is thus a rule of a higher type. It is the rule that says that other rules of scientific procedures must be designed in such a way that they do not protect any statement in science against falsification. Page 33, Logic of Scientific Discovery. So apparently Popper actually explained what the scientific method was, and he claimed it doesn't exist. So how are we going to reconcile this? The answer is, not surprisingly, it depends on what you mean by scientific method. So let's take a look at the full context of what Popper said when he said there wasn't a scientific method. Here's the actual quotes in context. Now let us begin our course. The course in scientific method, it is called Introduction to Scientific Method. And the first thing I want to say as an introduction is that it is a subject that does not exist. Now, the fact that this subject does not exist may strike some as strange. The usual idea of the scientific method is that there is a certain technique or procedure for making scientific discoveries, and that you can learn this technique and then apply it in science to make discoveries. According to the usual view, a man either knows scientific method and makes scientific discoveries, or he does not know scientific method and makes no discoveries, unless, of course, he should happen to make some by chance. If this is what is meant by scientific method, then the subject certainly does not exist, for there simply are no techniques or procedures for making discoveries in science. Contrary to the usual view, this is still Popper, there are many examples of scientists and many very great scientists who have only once in their lives made a major discovery. These are scientists who, even though they continued to be the forefront of science and were able to criticize other people's discoveries in a most excellent way, and even though they had problems they would have loved to solve and surely tried to solve, were never again able to make a major discovery. Now, this would be inexplicable if being a great scientist consisted in being an expert in scientific method. In other words, Popper is, this is me now, contextually arguing that there is a common misunderstanding of what the scientific method is as some magic automated procedure that you follow and it will inevitably make scientific discoveries. And he's saying this is not correct. There is no automatic procedure to make discoveries. The scientific method in this sense, does not exist. The real scientific method consists first of a creative conjecture phase that is entirely non-methodical. But once you make the conjecture, there's a definitive method to how to go about handling that conjecture in a scientific way. And that is the set of conventions we've been talking about, particularly the No-Ad-Hoc Rule. These conventions, such as the No-Ad-Hoc Rule, you should follow, Popper's arguing, or you'll quickly find it's impossible to falsify your theories and error correction will grind to a halt. You'll become satisfied with the pure logic you think your conjecture came from, and it will feel not like a conjecture, but like you reasoned to the truth. This is why, in the same lecture, Popper goes on to say, it, meaning the scientific method, exists only in the sense that we can study the ways of criticism. Once you realize this does, in my opinion, answer the question, how do we come up with new theories in the first place if you can't consider non-testable theories due to the No-Ad-Hoc Rule? The short answer is, you're allowed to make your own personal risk to pursue any conjecture you want for any reason you want. But that is completely different from having reasoned to a correct solution. On the contrary, during the conjecture phase, there is really no reason for anyone to take your conjecture seriously until you've made it independently testable to prove that it is not an ad hoc theory. I've mentioned before that in my disagreements with the people I've talked to, in many cases, they have reason to something they feel quite certain about. They don't know how to turn their theories into independently testable theories, but it just really feels like they've reasoned to something that's true. And then they can't seem to understand when I say something like, yes, that's an interesting conjecture. Feel free to keep pursuing it. Let me know if you find a way to make it testable. And then otherwise, I don't show much else interest in their theory. It's because this is their personal conjecture. It's not yet been turned into an independently testable theory, so it's not yet a theory that people should start adopting as if it's a best theory. To them, it feels like they found really good criticisms of the prevailing theory, and they think they've reasoned to the only possible alternative theory, so they can't understand why I'm not embracing their theories as if they're true. But the simple truth is that we often feel this way about our conjectures. We self-identify with our conjectures, and we tend to accidentally become dogmatic about them. But the correct fallibilist position is neither to reject these conjectures nor embrace them as correct, but instead to ask the person to make them independently testable. To summarize then, Popper's ratchet is one of the least talked about parts of Popper's epistemology. Most people don't even realize it is a crucial part of his epistemology. Even people that have extensively studied Popper's writings don't seem to have any knowledge of it, or if they do, they see it as optional. Popper's ratchet means you are only allowed to solve problems by making your theories more precise and increasing the empirical content of your theories, never by making them vaguer, adding degrees of freedom, or reducing the empirical content of our theories. I say our theories here because, of course, it may be that you're increasing the empirical content of an auxiliary theory, not the theory proper, but either is fine. It's the overall level of empirical content that goes up. It doesn't have to be the theory itself. It may be the theory itself, but it doesn't have to be.
Always be trying to make our theories more empirical.
Yes.
That's kind of the gist of it. That's where the direction the ratchets should be turning.